Date is May 14th, 2025. And before President Trump made his way to Qatar, he wrapped up his visit to Saudi Arabia by shaking hands with the man who is not only a former key member of ISIS, who then became one of the founding members of al-Nusra Front, or the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria, who then had a bounty from the US on his head, but who is also the man who is now the quote unquote president of Syria. I say that because he certainly wasn't elected by the Syrian people. I'm, of course, talking about Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, who is also shaking the hands of Trump, the man who, during his first term in office, recognized Israel's illegal occupation of the Golan Heights and became the first U.S. president to do so. The hypocrisy is truly never ending, but that's also the case for the ongoing impacts of U.S. foreign policy. We see it in the conflicts that the U.S. has picked decades ago and the ones that the U.S. continues to pursue today against major countries like Russia and China, and it continues to inform the way that they are responding to the U.S. We got into all of the latest on a number of the biggest conflicts happening right now with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Vijay Prashad, the Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Leftward Books, and Chief Correspondent at Globetrotter. Vijay, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Now, I want to get your take on a few different things, but I want to start out with the latest coming out of the Middle East, because I know that that's where we've seen U.S. President Trump making unprecedented arms deals and meeting with the former Al-Qaeda leader turned Syrian president in Saudi Arabia. But we've also seen reports that Israel is using dozens of bunker buster bombs on a hospital in southern Gaza, killing dozens of Palestinians there in strikes that they claim are targeted at the latest leader of Hamas, Mohammed Sinwar. So I want to get your take on kind of the latest going on in the Middle East and this parallel that we're seeing. On one hand, you've got Trump surrounded by money and deals, and on the other hand, Israel is doing what they can to continue to go after the Palestinians.
I mean, firstly, it is just atrocious what has been happening since the so-called ceasefire that was there over the in January. You know, that the end of that ceasefire has seen a vicious set of massacres, the destruction of the only hospital, the siege on allowing food and water into Gaza, you know, famine conditions. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN has basically declared a famine in Gaza. That's a very serious declaration. It's not a trivial matter. The killing of a young boy, 12-year-old boy, who actually was the eyewitness to the capture and killing of medics, the massacre of the medics. I mean, you know, this is happening without any oversight. There is no oversight. Israeli government says, well, you know, that we agree there was a massacre of the medics. We agree that the bodies were buried and the cars were blown up and so on to remove the evidence. But we're just going to change the leader of that group. You know, nobody gets punished. They agreed that this was a, you know, violent action within a war, within the context of a war. They illegally killed medics, then they tried to hide it. They agreed that they had done all that, but there was no justice, even within the context of the so-called Israeli justice system, you know, which they always claim to be the most human rights military in the world. Well, you have just said that your own soldiers committed a war crime. They killed medics and they tried to bury it. And then you said nobody gets punished. And then one of the eyewitnesses gets shot on the beach and killed. I mean, what is going on here? You know, there is absolutely free for all, you know, the Israelis. But I can see why Netanyahu is angry with the Palestinians, because on the 27th of January, tens of thousands of Palestinians from southern Gaza in a very organized fashion marched back to their homes in northern Gaza, living in rubble in which there are bodies of dead Palestinians. We don't know how many Palestinians are buried in the rubble. They're living in tents and so on in the north, in defiance of the genocide. They said, no, wait a minute, there's going to be no Trump Riviera where there was Gaza City. We're going home. And in a sense, I think Netanyahu and his crew are punishing the Palestinians for what I feel is invalidating the effect of the genocide. They thought they'll scour the Palestinians to southern Gaza, to Rafah, and eventually bulldoze them into Egypt. But no, they went right back to Gaza, and they're trying to punish the people. This is a collective punishment to the people in northern Gaza, either to kill them or get them to leave again, to evict them again from their homes. So Israel is a mess, and Mr. Trump, is no different in a sense from Biden and Harris, because Mr. Trump is giving Israel the green light. So did Biden and Harris, continuing to arm Israel and so on, and trying, your examples are very important, trying to get Syria with this, as you said, former Al-Qaeda, and then now President Jabhat al-Nusra leader, now president of Syria, trying to get Syria, like Jordan and like Egypt, Egypt in 1979, Jordan in 1994, trying to get Syria to sign a peace deal with Israel, despite the fact that Syria is holding the Golan Heights and more than that. I mean, remember, this so-called president of Syria had the name Mr. Jolani, a man of the Golan Heights. And he's willing, I think, to give up the Golan Heights, give up the extra territory, the so-called buffer zone that Israel has seized in a peace agreement, which means that the three major Arab countries, the fourth being Lebanon, would have then signed a peace deal with Israel, Lebanon being the standout. But now with Hezbollah largely disabled, or rather battered very badly, its former leader Nasrallah assassinated, Lebanon is much weaker in its ability to assist the Palestinians. So, here you have it. Trump is in the Middle East watching the ongoing vicious, much more vicious than 2024 attack on the Palestinians, and then trying to make a deal with the Syrians so that they basically give up their solidarity with the Palestinians. I mean, it's a mess, okay? It's a real mess. And at the same time, in the United States, prosecuting people who are trying to stand up for the Palestinians, it's a mess.
It really is. And yeah, as you were describing it there, I was thinking, you look at the fact that even just looking at this meeting between Trump and al-Jolani, the two of them shaking hands, you've got this guy who had a bounty on his head from the US, right? At one point, the US government was trying to kill him, and he's shaking hands with the guy who recognized the illegal occupation of the Golan Heights, was the first US president to ever do it, and they're acting like they're all friends. That should be a very powerful statement. But beyond that, just the fact that you have Saudi Arabia, welcoming Trump in, they may claim that, oh yeah, they want to see a ceasefire. They haven't done anything for the Palestinians. Qatar hasn't either. Not that I would necessarily expect either of them to. But as you mentioned there, when it comes to the harm that has been done to the axis of resistance through the killing of Nasrallah, through the overthrow of Assad in Syria, what are your concerns about what this means for the overall region and kind of what the multipolar world is or isn't able to do? Because we've seen, yes, China and Russia, they're more powerful than they have been in recent decades. But when it comes to this ongoing genocide that we're seeing before our eyes, that is still a major problem.
I think this is a very important area of discussion. And I would say that despite the emergence of a kind of Chinese power, and despite the emergence of Russia back, from the lost decade when Yeltsin and Putin in the first instance were presidents from 1991 till about 2008, that was a lost period, maybe a decade and a half, when Russia really was in a bad situation. The standard of living collapsed, life expectancy collapsed, and so on. But Russia reappeared. That's true. But they remain in my opinion, defensive powers. Both Russia and China feel threatened by the United States, by the fact that the United States in 2019 withdrew from the intermediate nuclear treaty, and they both fear. I mean, Mr. Putin said it directly. Fears the entry of mid-range missiles from the United States to be placed in Ukraine. I mean, I know that the Chinese fear that this ramp up with Taiwan might lead to the placing of mid-range nuclear missiles in Taipei. That would be catastrophic. So these are defensive powers. They are not able to do everything one imagines. They still worry about attacks on them by the overwhelming ability of the United States to destroy countries. You see, the US is not a country that is able to conquer places. It can't conquer territory. It can't conquer Afghanistan. They were defeated on the ground. It can't conquer Iraq. They were also told to leave. It can't conquer Libya, but they can destroy countries. They destroyed Libya. They destroyed Afghanistan. They really destroyed parts of Iraq, Fallujah, Ramadi, very large parts of Baghdad, and so on. So the Chinese fear that, if 10 missiles get fired at Beijing, that's catastrophic. They don't want that. They don't want to provoke the United States at this point, which is why they are very tentative in their dealing with the US. They are strong on trade. They negotiate hard and so on. In fact, I think they won this round of the trade war in Geneva with the United States. Even the Spectator magazine said China won the thing, the Wall Street Journal and so on. But they are not going to confront the US where they put themselves in the way of US military power. For instance, you might know that in the Eastern Mediterranean, the United States basically cordoned the Eastern Mediterranean with its fleet, preventing, let's say, a Chinese ship to come in and try to give assistance to the Palestinians, to rescue them or whatever. The US has built a cordon. You'd have to clash with US ships in the Eastern Mediterranean. If, let's say, Russians tried to give assistance via the Red Sea, that whole area is governed by the United States. But for the fact that Ansar Allah in Yemen has been firing rockets at Israel, the United States from Qatar across the Gulf control that area militarily, in the sea. So these countries are first defensive powers. This is not a multipolar world yet. That might be an aspiration. They are trying to defend themselves from the madcap behavior of the major military power in the world. Now, it's true that the United States no longer controls, science and technology or raw materials all over the world, or even finance, but they still control information and they still control weapon systems. I'm glad you have a show, but I mean, US media still is the dominant media. Reuters, Associated Press, these agencies still shape people's understanding of what's happening in Sudan or what's happening in the DRC, in the Congo. And so the information setup is still dominated by the West, and so is military power. The Chinese brought the 14 Palestinian factions to Beijing to have a discussion, first time ever. And they had a statement and so on. They can do those things. They can maybe provide some material aid in terms of relief, put some money into UNRWA. They've done all those things. But, when it comes to direct challenging diplomacy, I don't feel that they are confident enough, and nor are the Russians. At Moscow for the 80th anniversary of the end of fascism, the Russians had everybody there, Ibrahim Traore from Burkina Faso and so on. But I don't think they are going to come out there and directly confront the West on things that are not directly about them, like protecting their borders in the Ukraine area.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important point, and I appreciate you laying it out like that because, and I do feel that frustration, right, in some of those places, and maybe that's just because we have so many conversations about this growing multipolar world, but it's like, we're not quite there yet. We're on the way, but we're not quite to that point where I think a lot of people ideally in their minds would love to be. And it's good to remember, the threats that the US does put out there and why major countries like Russia and China have to handle their responses, right? They have to be aware of those threats and the way that the US is actively trying to target them. Now, while I have you here, I do want to mention the situation, the latest conflict between India and Pakistan. I know that right now we're kind of in a place of a ceasefire where things are at a standstill, but there has been a lot of conversation about the obvious concerns of these two neighboring nuclear powered neighbors going to war. And also about what it says about the global arms race, how Pakistan's Chinese fighter jets faced off against India's French fighter jets. Not so much about conversation about the civilians who were impacted, but I do want to know, how do you view this conflict and what are the chances that we could see more escalation in the near future?
It's very interesting and a very complicated issue, but there were two issues, or maybe three, involved in this particular conflict. Before I get to these three issues, it's important to know that India and Pakistan have effectively had a ceasefire since 1948. There was a war in 1948 in Kashmir. There was kind of a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities. There's a line of control in Kashmir. It's not a border because the whole thing is disputed. There was a war in 1965. There was a war in 1971, largely about East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. There was a war in 1999 in Kargil, up in the Kashmir area. And so there's been a ceasefire. In 1972, after the 1971 war, which created Bangladesh, there was an agreement in Simla between Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but it wasn't exactly a peace agreement. Some people call it a peace agreement, but it wasn't a peace because the borders were not delimited. When you have undelimited borders and heavy militarization, it's not really a peace agreement, it's a ceasefire. So there's been a long ceasefire. It's not like there was a ceasefire now. What there was now is a de-escalation. There's a long ceasefire, then there's escalations, which sometimes lead to wars. And this was an escalation that there was a de-escalation after the escalation. Okay, it wasn't that really that the ceasefire was the status quo, which has been there. It's a funny little distinction just to say this is a very long conflict. But here are some points that I want to make about that. The first point was that both India and Pakistan have an idea of strategic, using these strategic assets in each other's country. So every country has some problem with minority rights. In Pakistan, it's with the people in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it's in Balochistan, a little bit in Sindh, and so on. In India, it's in Kashmir. In India, Kashmir is a serious disputed area, and the Indian government in recent times has behaved appallingly. I mean, they took away a constitutional amendment, Article 370, which provided Kashmir with certain special privileges and so on. That was a violation of the agreement with the Kashmiri people. It took away statehood from the Kashmiris, made it a central territory for a while, broke it up into three. Anyway, they behave appallingly. There's an enormous number of troops there and so on. But this idea of strategic depth that is there in both countries means that India clandestinely assists groups in Balochistan that provide problems to the Pakistani state. And the Pakistanis, in turn, provide assistance to groups and rile them up in Kashmir and provide assistance. So this idea of strategic depth is seriously problematic for both countries, because rather than allow countries to deal with their issues, you are interfering with the country clandestinely. And this drives both countries crazy and nobody benefits from it. So there has to be a real discussion, frank and open, is to stop the strategic depth policy. Secondly, because there's an issue in Kashmir over the legitimacy of the Indian army being there and so on, there's a lot of problems there which are political and have not been solved, and they've created an armed insurgency. And there are groups, some of them based in Pakistan, not all, that cross the border and conduct terrible acts of violence, like what happened in Pahalgam, a terrorist attack where people who asked their religion and shot for the so-called wrong religion. This kind of thing is appalling. There are regular terrorist attacks, both in Pakistan and in India. And this is appalling. And they are done by similar groups that have been incubated, some of them, with the assistance of the United States, for destabilizing Afghanistan when the Soviets were there and when there was the socialist government there. The Pakistani defense minister went on Yalda Hakim's show and he said this directly. We used to do the dirty work for the Americans. We don't want to do this anymore. The Indians and Pakistanis need to work together to find some sort of discussion point to lessen the tension around Kashmir and to solve the problems of the Kashmiri people. Like, it's unlikely that a state of Kashmir will be built, an independent state, because it's a very complicated terrain, but they're going to have to figure out a solution of justice for the Kashmiri people. This is just a very long-term problem that needs to have a mature discussion. The third issue is the actual air war that took place, because the military and navy didn't operate, was really not about Kashmir. The Indians tried to dismantle Pakistan's air defense, to send a message to Pakistan that if you try anything with us, we can destroy you. So no Indian plane crossed into Pakistani territory, no Pakistani plane crossed into Indian territory. The first day was the attempt to destroy the air defenses. After that, after it really didn't happen properly, because India underestimated Pakistan's ability to defend its air defenses, they turned into a drone attack on both sides. There were swarms of drones, loitering munitions, all kinds of things. This is a draw in many ways. This air war was a draw. And so they decided to de-escalate. Whether Trump played an actual role or not is a separate issue. But the de-escalation happened. And now we are back to the status quo. But the issue wasn't Kashmir when the air war happened. It was India and Pakistan demonstrating their technological abilities, one trying to jam the other and so on. And really, it came to the point that neither had dominance in this air war. So they basically de-escalated for that reason. The question of who did the attack in Pahalgam wasn't solved. It's not there. So the second issue is the primary open sore. Both countries need to stop strategic depth policies, in my opinion, interfering with each other's armed struggles inside the country. Secondly, we really need to figure out justice for the Kashmiri people. There needs to be a discussion about that. And third, look, nobody can win a war. So calm down.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to me, and I appreciate you explaining all of that, because this is one of those conflicts where, and I will be the first to say that it's not a region of the world that I typically cover as much, but I was overwhelmed by the amount of propaganda from both sides on social media, right? The amount of fake videos that were out there. And it was one of those things where I'm having to take a step back and go, okay, what is actually happening here? And as you noted, look, this is a long-standing conflict. It didn't happen overnight, and there is a lot more to it than even what a lot of pundits are really getting into, as they want to either, choose one side as the winner, or in some cases say, hey, Trump solved all of this, as he's trying to claim that he is. And so I appreciate that breakdown. The last thing that I wanted to get into with you while I have you here is the latest in terms of what could be transpiring in Istanbul coming up on Thursday, because I know that, we've had a lot of back and forth about talks. Russian President Putin proposed a return to direct negotiations with Kiev after Russia's previous attempt back in March 2022 that was then cut short by then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's surprise visit to Kiev in April. But while this 2022 version did include direct talks, it notably did not include the heads of state, but yet Zelensky seems to think that, Putin is going to show up here, we're all going to talk and figure everything out. That's not quite what I got from the Russian side. So what is your take on this yet another mess? Is there a chance at a deal, or are we still so far from that, given all of the concerns Russia has mentioned that the US hasn't even started to address?
Well, it's interesting because the Istanbul is the location. Just recently, the PKK, which is the Kurdish resistance army, has decided to de-escalate its conflict against the Turkish state and to enter into a political negotiation. So the armed struggle is going to end. It's very interesting that this is happening in Istanbul, in Ankara, at the backdrop of the meeting regarding Ukraine. And why I'm bringing that up is it tells you a little bit about how conflicts have to be solved. Despite 50 years of armed struggle, you got to solve things politically. Nobody can win a war properly. And in Ukraine, this has become a clear sign. In fact, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there should have been more conflicts when these countries emerged out of the Soviet Union. There were none. The first border conflict took place in Georgia in 2008, which is it's whatever it is, 17 years after the Soviet Union collapsed. Around the same time, there began to be rumblings in Ukraine, particularly among Russian-speaking populations, as they saw the rise of a Ukrainian far right, which said, there should be no Russian allowed. They started talking about naming streets after fascists, Ukrainian fascists, and so on. There was a kind of rumbling of discontent in eastern Ukraine, where people were like, look, we want to continue to speak Russian. We don't want Stefan Bander and other fascists to have streets named. And, Forward newspaper in New York City ran a story about which countries have the most celebratory monuments to fascists, including street names and so on. And on top of the list was Ukraine. They were returning to name streets after actual collaborators with the Nazis and authentic Ukrainian fascists. So there was an upsurge in the East. So what is very clear is, because of this war in Ukraine, that at the table, I just don't think that the Ukrainians will be able to recover eastern Ukraine. I don't think they'll recover Crimea. And the Russians have built a land bridge through Mariupol, which I think they are just going to hold. So I think whatever negotiation happens, the northern cities of the Northeast, Russians will probably give up to Ukraine. But I think this L shape from Crimea up to the northern Donbass is not going to move. So I feel like whatever negotiation happens is going to not shift that geography. That region, the old naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea, the city of Mariupol, and the cities in the authentic Donbass, not in the kind of penumbra of the Donbass, are already part of Russia, and I don't think that's going to move. So Zelensky is going to have to just allow that to be the new Ukraine. I think that's what the Russians will put on the table, and they'll give up the cities in the northeast back to the Ukrainians. I think Ukraine will have to take this deal because none of the European powers will be able to help them sufficiently. And no European power wants to go into a long war with the Russians. I think they are eager to get Russian natural gas back. Their fuel inflation is too high. They're going to keep losing elections. As a consequence, a far right will emerge. And that maybe is something that they are having to consider. I mean, the fact that J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference and says you have to be nicer to the far right, that's what he effectively said, should be chilling to the so-called centrists in Europe. That the Trump administration doesn't care. If you let the war go on, the far right is going to win. And the Trump administration doesn't care. They would welcome it. If you stop the war and the natural gas comes in, maybe the far right will be stopped. And the Trump administration doesn't care either because they just want the war to end. So either way, the Europeans are going to have to allow a deal. And the only deal, I'm saying to you, is one in which this L-shaped part of Ukraine is part of Russia. There's no other deal on the table.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch too, as I know that Zelensky has had some statements kind of saying, oh, well, yeah, sure, we'll have a diplomatic solution, but we won't really recognize that. And I'm going, he needs to be listening to even what Trump is saying, where he's telling him, hey, I'm trying to preserve a Ukraine for you, right? I'm trying to make sure you still have a country left. You need to get with the program in some ways. I'm very curious to see what does happen in terms of the talks that are coming up. But I know the common theme and everything that we've discussed today is that a lot of these are long-running conflicts that are not going to be solved overnight. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to give your insight and to break down all of the latest here. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Leftward Books, and Chief Correspondent at Globetrotter. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.